So thank you again, everyone. Yale Alumni Nonprofit Alliance, otherwise known as YANA, our monthly program. I'm Rachel Littman, Saybrook class of 91. I'm the executive director, and thank you again for supporting us and for being here. So to our topic, again, we decided to get it down, and thank you to Andrea and Jim for helping me figure out kind of the overarching topic, and not just social impact bonds, because that's very specific, but really sort of talking about creative ways of sourcing and investing capital for social impact initiatives and projects. And usually when we think of funding for nonprofits and social impact ventures, we often think of what we know in the US is sort of private philanthropy by individuals, or maybe foundation investments. Sometimes, depending what sector you're in, there could be government grants or partnerships. But there really are very many and sort of more creative and newer ways of financing social ventures that organizations and nonprofits and organizations and people in the space can put together to form a kind of capital structure to help advance these projects and then provide the measures of impact and not just that go much beyond what we may be thinking about of a nonprofit side, which is or in the private sector, what's the return on investment? How many people were served? How many hits did you get on your social media channels? Things like that. We're looking at much broader impact. So tonight's program, we're going to take a wide exploration. We're going to talk about projects going on in everywhere from Detroit to England to Kenya to Haiti. And then we'll take also some deep dives into some of the specifics of the forms of impact investing, or what is known as social or development impact, quote, bonds. And we'll get into why that's a quote, and the ways in which social impact capital is being resourced and used not only to, as we said, not treat the symptoms and the outcomes of social problems, the number of people who are homeless, and how does that number go down, the number of guns taken off the street, the number of beds filled at a homeless shelter, et cetera. But we're really sort of getting to the heart of how do we start about working on reducing and preventing the kinds of harms that many of the nonprofits and governments that we're all working to treat and to fix. So I want to first welcome and introduce our panelists. So Andrea Schorr is the Yale College class of 93. Thank you for joining us, Andrea. She currently works on grant and impact investment funding for Develop Detroit, and we'll learn about that, which is a nonprofit affordable housing developer based in Detroit, Michigan. Andrea has several decades of experience in philanthropy and nonprofit business management, and she has an expertise in nonprofit financial management, project management, fund development, and government and foundation grant management. This is terrific. This is a lot of what the heart of how we actually get to do what we do. And she's been the founding manager at 2 education service startups and has special interests in impact investments, social enterprise, and mentoring future managers. Outside of her professional pursuits, Andrea works on support and advocacy for the LGBTQ plus community. And during the 2018 election cycle, she served as the chair of the LGBTQ political caucus for the Maryland Democratic Party. Wide range of experience. So thank you, Andrea. Jim Seymour is joining us as well. He's class of 69. He is the managing partner of Pontefract Global Strategies, where he advises young private equity firms, primarily in frontier emerging markets, with an emphasis on social impact investing. Jim has decades and decades of working in emerging markets, with almost 20 years in international banking, 15 years managing international emerging markets, private equity funds of funds. And he's lived in Bahrain, the Philippines, Taiwan, Turkey, London, and has lots of experiences in these parts of the world. His many pro bono activities include advising, coaching, and like Andrea, a lot of mentoring to startup social enterprises and young adults. And he's the advisor to the Capstone Impact Investments, which facilitates social impact investments in opportunity zones. And just wanted to mention, after this program, if you want to kind of dive back into what are opportunity zones, we did a program, it's on our YouTube channel back in November 2020 on opportunity zones themselves. And we had people from Connecticut and Chicago and Tulane, a bunch of other people. So we're going to start fresh on the kind of the update, and let's talk about social impact bonds and these various ways of sourcing capital. So the first question I want to say is let's see if we can start with some basic definitions for our audience. I didn't really know, I'm not in this space, what a social impact bond was exactly. And so maybe you guys can help us enlighten, the history of this sector, what these sort of pay for success social issue funding models are. And just by what I've learned, and Jim, I'm probably going to have to start with you, is that I understand the concept started in the United Kingdom with someone called Sir Ronald Cohen. And in the US, it caught here around 2012 when Massachusetts was looking for a more innovative way to tackle chronic homelessness and juvenile justice. And in New York City, they were able to come up with a social impact bond on trying to reduce juvenile recidivism. So those were the sort of first governments in the US to implement pay for success financing for the quote, what works initiatives. I looked at a recent report that said the industry, at least a year or two ago, has several hundred, maybe 200 active social impact bonds, almost $500 million in committed funding. I'm sure that's much bigger, and presumably a concomitant or more amount in the societal savings in both financial and human capital. So that's kind of my introduction. But Jim, let's start with you, because I think chronologically you had some first contact with Ron Cohen's private equity fund, and you became aware of what he was doing in social impact investing and what he founded and how that inspired you. So can you tell us a little bit about like what you learned about that, kind of what the history of this sort of social finance aspect is, and how successful these things doing? And let's just sort of open it up with that.
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks for putting this together. It's wonderful to be able to talk about this subject to a broad community and a very diverse community in terms of the interest. I see, there have been representatives from the public health school, from divinity school, forestry school, and I think that's really wonderful. I would start by saying, you asked about the definition, and I would say—
Yeah, let's start the definition, and then maybe the history of it, but we can—
Well, but that's the most challenging part of it. What exactly is social impact? And I would say it's an evolutionary term. It's an evolutionary sector. It's only about 20 years old or so, and people are still defining it, quite frankly. It is I view it really as a nuance of the priority of the investment. Are you making the investment for a financial return, or are you making the investment for a social good, a return on social good? And I think that's kind of the nuance. And during the evolutionary stage, you'll have seen that some private equity firms, for example, or investment firms, are now going back and saying, well, of course, what we did had social impact. That may or may not be true, but you can see that people are kind of revising history. So it is evolutionary. My experience began in yes, I was on the advisory board for Ronald Cohen's private equity fund, Apax UK. Apax is now a huge global firm. And being on the advisory board, I was able to have conversations with him several times a year from 1993 to 2006, talking about what he was doing outside of Apax. And in 2002 or thereabouts, he started Bridges Ventures with Michelle Giddens in the UK. And the premise was to gather together high net worth individuals to invest in a fund, Bridges Ventures, which would invest in depressed inner cities in the UK, in small businesses which could not otherwise gain access to capital, and also to provide strategic advice, business advice, if you will, to these small businesses. This was the first fund that I'm aware of that actually reported a social impact to its investors and its quarterly reports, in addition to the financial return. Now, mind you, this is 20 years ago. It was nascent, embryonic, fairly simple stuff, straightforward. But the point was that it was putting equal weight on the social impact of their investments in those companies, whether it be the number of employees, the amount of money spent towards training the employees, the compensation, benefits, et cetera, healthcare benefits for the families, and all that. In addition to Bridges Ventures, he was also investing in low-income housing in Palestine. And I found that was really interesting. I'm an internationalist. I saw this as really kind of crossing any kind of religious or political boundaries. He's Jewish. He lives part-time in Tel Aviv, part-time in London, but he's a son of a diplomat. He was born in Cairo. He speaks Arabic, Hebrew, German, French, and English. And I just felt that there's really something here that goes beyond politics, that it providing social good for places that otherwise have very limited access to capital. He also then started in 2007 Social Finance UK. And this was the first, if you want to call it that, social impact bond to address the problem of recidivism in the city of Peterborough. Recidivism had a cost to the city. There were halfway houses that would address prisoners coming out of prison. Some were good, some were not. But as nonprofits, the halfway houses, the management of the halfway houses would spend 75, 80% of their time trying to raise money just to operate for the next year. So how could they plan long-term to build their capacity and increase their services? So he structured this a $5 million sterling bond guaranteed by the city of Peterborough, where the capital was put in by investors, and due diligence was done on halfway houses, and investments were made in the better ones to expand their capabilities. And the return to the investors was determined by the reduction in recidivism, which would reduce the cost of police, court, jail time costs to the city of Peterborough. After 10 years, it matured in April 2017, there was about a 3% return to the investors because of a 20% or so reduction in recidivism. And the cost savings was split 50% between the city of Peterborough and the investors. So that was the first, to my knowledge, first social impact bond. He then started social finance in the US, in Boston, Tracy Palandrian, and they have essentially done the same thing here in the US, and has moved on beyond recidivism, addressing, as you mentioned, homelessness, upskilling, areas like that. And Andrea can go into much more depth about the homeless and the housing. I'm just trying to give kind of the overview and the history. His latest venture is an education outcome bond to finance education in Africa, starting in Sierra Leone, where a bond is raised guaranteed by the governments and facilities of Sierra Leone. And investments are made in schools to increase the accessibility of schools to primary students. And the return to the investors then is based on the number of the students entered, enrolled, graduated, and there's a premium for the number of girls. And this is a common theme for me as well, because I believe very strongly we should be investing a lot more in the education of young girls and women around the world. So to just kind of sum that up at this piece, I began to see that social impact investing is convergence of philanthropy and investment. And I would argue, maybe not correctly, but philanthropists are increasingly dissatisfied with the outcome of their grants and donations. And I believe part of the reason is insufficient accountability and oversight of that, and treating it as an investment with an expected return, a financial return and a social return, makes it a much more disciplined approach. So it's been slow in evolving. We can talk more about what's happening now. I know Carl earlier on said this endowment is looking to go into social impact investing. And I can tell you my stories with a major foundation here, trying to get them to invest part of their endowment in a social impact fund, and the response I got before there was a change in management of that foundation. But I'll stop there, Rachel.
I think that's great. I think that helps lay the ground, and I had added in the chat for those, and we'll send these out later if you're interested in doing some deep dives into what some of these particular impact bonds were. I think one of the ones I think about the New York City one had some beautiful. I don't know if anybody else here was a structured finance attorney, but would like to draw pictures and understand how the money flows and who's guaranteeing. So I was very appreciative of the charts that some of these write-ups about some of these bonds have put out there. So that helps visualize kind of who the parties are. We'll get more into that. Andrea, you've been managing nonprofits to use some of these things. Tell us your perspective and what your definition is and how you come to this work.
Great. And thank you. I'm going to echo Jim. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be in this very interesting discussion tonight. So I think the the way I can best contribute to this part of our conversation is to offer an example of the outcomes of the social impact bond that I had the opportunity to see directly up close on the ground last year at a housing developers conference. So this conference was held in downtown Denver. Downtown Denver is the location of a really dynamic affordable housing organization that is focused on addressing chronic homelessness. That's their core mission. Interestingly, they do a range of services, but their actual the core expertise that they started off with was related to health. And they got into housing, maybe for the obvious reason that if your goal is to address the health issues of folks who are unhoused or underhoused, it's hard for them to get to a place of sustainable health and wellness without sustainable affordable housing. It's like those issues are connected. And so they over time developed expertise in managing affordable housing and actually building affordable housing. And so and they're also a federally qualified health center. So anyone who in this discussion has a background in healthcare, I have worked with the healthcare organizations a little in my career, and so I do have some knowledge of what that kind of funding looks like. It's sophisticated, it's complicated. You have to develop specific technical expertise just to even manage the financing for that kind of work, in addition to the service provision. So this affordable housing organization that exists to address chronic homelessness in Denver also has expertise in operating community health facilities that provide primary care, mental health care. They've even linked up with hospitals, and so if a local hospital takes in patients who are unhoused, and actually in many states, the hospital can't just release somebody who still needs care if they don't have housing. They've actually partnered with this organization to provide specialized housing for that particular demographic. So that's the mix of services that this particular organization, which again is the Denver Coalition for the Homeless, that they provide. So there is a Denver Social Impact Bond that was created to address the issue of chronic homelessness in Denver. So you have this service provider, which I mentioned, Denver Coalition for the Homeless, as one partner. You have the city of Denver backing, as Jim mentioned, there's a government entity that typically is going to back the investment. You have private investors who in this case invested $8 million over a 5-year period. And then you need a financial intermediary. And in the housing sector, that would be an organization like Enterprise Community Partners, right, which manages New Markets tax credit financing and other kinds of financing that takes funding from private investors. It then becomes available to nonprofits, also for-profit housing organizations in some cases. So you need that financial intermediary, right, to connect the private investors to this nonprofit partner that is providing, in this case, housing as well as health services. And so, again, $8 million over 5 years, and the kinds of outcomes they were looking to address. So you have individuals and families who have not been housed, right? And again, their specialty is individuals and families where that's become a chronic situation. And so you're providing permanent supportive housing is the term in the affordable housing field. It's a combination of affordable housing with services associated with it. The Denver Coalition for the Homeless also has expertise and capacity in providing different kinds of healthcare. And of course, they can do that at lower costs than folks showing up in an emergency room for services, which becomes a social cost, right? Because the hospital ends up having to pass that cost on to other participants in the healthcare system when you have somebody who is uninsured or is underinsured showing up for healthcare services that they can't fully pay for. And so the results of that Denver social impact bond to address chronic homelessness were successful. There's a case study available, so you can read all about this. And the success metrics were how many housing units were created, and or sustained in this project. What was the occupancy? Were the residents of housing actually successfully able to contribute their portion of the rent? What kinds of supports did they need? Did they receive those supports in order to be able to sustain their housing leases? And then there were a lot of healthcare metrics that they were able to measure. So, was there a reduction in utilization of certain kinds of healthcare services such as emergency care? And of course, if you have families successfully accessing affordable housing, staying in it, increasing their health and wellness, as demonstrated through lower need for healthcare services, these are all measurable outcomes. When those metrics were achieved, the city then followed through on a commitment to actually pay a financial return to the investor. So that's a pretty straightforward example, I think, of that kind of funding and action. I have shared this example with my colleagues in Detroit because we're hoping maybe Detroit can become another city where we have the opportunity to create this kind of funding model and implement it over a period of 5 years or more and evaluate it and see how it works.
Thank you, Andrea. Question kind of for both of you, so we can get a little more into the nitty gritty of this. Of like, how do these get initiated? Is it an investment opportunity? Is it the government? Or I can imagine there are a lot of nonprofits who probably would think like, well, we can do this really well. We just need the funding for this. So, right, somebody has to select the nonprofit. Somebody has to figure out what the outcomes are. I understand there are the investors. There's maybe there's a guarantor, which could be something else. I know in New York City, I think Bloomberg Philanthropy did that one. You may need a third party evaluator to figure out whether or not they've met their conditions. As far as like, Andrew, how do these things get put together? I know you've done it yourself. You said, or you've worked on this, leveraging multi-millions of dollars of investment capital for a relatively small nonprofit from where you're sitting. Maybe can you give us a little bit more insight to how this stuff actually gets done?
Sure. So I heard directly from the leaders of the Denver Coalition for the Homeless. And they initiated it. And I just kind of smiled when I heard that, because that's how it works in Detroit. Okay. We have to go to the city, to our philanthropy partners, to our financial intermediary partners like Enterprise, CDFIs. We have to do it. It would be unusual for somebody to just come to us with that kind of opportunity and sort of drop it in our lap. So, I mean, it's a challenge, but I hope there's an optimistic message there. We're a small nonprofit developer, and the mayor of Detroit will take our phone calls and work with us. And this is apparently what happened in Denver. And that's what made their project happen. And we're hoping we can do similar kinds of work in Detroit. And of course, I'll have examples of some other projects we've worked on that have very similar elements.
Okay, maybe we'll get back into that. So the question is what happens? You guys are sitting around and says, we need more people involved, and who do we know? Let's go call them. But we'll come back to that. Jim, what about your experience for knowing how these things kind of come together? I mean, you've worked also internationally and seen in places where there's high needs, limited resources, but maybe more involvement by government agencies or international NGOs.
Yeah, they come together with great difficulty, and a lot of patience is required. It varies. I would say that in my experience, it's usually entrepreneurs, local or otherwise, who identify a need and build a company around that. getting that initial funding is extremely difficult because there's no track record. Oftentimes it's friends of family, donations, grants, what have you. But even with trying to get the larger grants from foundations or government entities, they want to see a track record. So it's almost a catch 22 problem. We're going through this with Girls First Finance in Kenya now. This very quickly, this is an initiative to address a problem in Kenya. 50% of the young women in Kenya finance their tertiary education through prostitution because they are not brought up with that development of inner strength, confidence, self-empowerment, and they don't have access to low-interest loans. So we're developing an app to address the first part of that equation. Once they have committed up to performing on the app, then they'll be eligible for low-interest loans. We are getting funds with difficulty from UK foundations. UK foundations tend, this is a generalization, but because it's in Africa, the European foundations and governments tend to be more accustomed to working in Africa than Americans are. But we're also working with the Development Finance Corporation, the old OPIC, in Washington to help put together the loan funding. But it's a chicken and the egg. We're trying to build the app, bootstrap the app to get customer users on the app to be able to demonstrate a track record that we can then go to foundations or DFIs to get the funding. So it varies. And some are strictly nonprofit. And in some senses, in the US anyway, it can almost be easier to raise money by a nonprofit because of the tax benefits of donations rather than trying to establish a corporation and get equity. Where it is more difficult is in the softer areas. For example, I'm on the board of an accelerator in Providence called, or I was until Social Enterprise Greenhouse. So a lot of the coaching I've done has come from entrepreneurs out of that. One, for example, is a woman who is, because I think there was a School of Drama people on the list here, is a drama therapy individual, a clinician. And she has written plays to address the opioid addiction. She's lost 6 good friends from overdose and tried to destigmatize opioid addiction by writing a play, having talkbacks. But the difficulty is that raising money for prevention in something like that is almost more difficult than raising money to address the addiction itself. So that's same thing with music therapy. I'm on the board of a music therapy nonprofit, and raising money can be very difficult. And music therapy is being proven more and more to be very effective in addressing aphasia or Parkinson's disease. But it's very difficult to find qualified clinicians. So, but back to the sourcing, there is varied. One of the complaints I would have is that many of the providers, the institutional providers, have a shorter term time horizon. And I mean, this is even the DFIs. I mean, I would argue that the development finance institutions, I would argue that they are the ones who should be going in and taking a long-term view, taking that early risk for the social good. But even they look for some sort of return earlier on. If you're investing in a small company in a small frontier emerging market, it's going to take a long time to build that value to be able to provide that return that they're looking for, leaving aside the social return. So that, to me, they cut off their nose to spite themselves. But so the sourcing initially comes from high net worth individuals or donations. And then foundations are good at donations, not so good at investing in terms of social impact. That's an evolutionary thing. And I do want to come back and talk about that a bit because that is changing dramatically. And now you're seeing, of course, the large bulge bracket investment firms. And again, this is all part of the evolution. But right now, there's a groundswell towards social impact. And now we're also seeing some countervailing forces as it relates to ESG investments, which is another whole topic. I'm speaking from Florida here,
Okay.
but I'll stop there because I don't want to be rambling too long.
Okay, no, I think that's good. I think hopefully we're starting to get a picture of some of the players and how they come to this. Andrea, do you want to talk? Yeah, tell us, dive into this. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to jump in and piggyback really quickly off of Jim's, comment he made in his close there about foundations and investments. And I have worked with anyone who looks me up on LinkedIn will see I've worked with several foundations. So I know this issue from the other side. I would challenge anyone who's working with a mission-oriented based organization, regardless of whether that's a nonprofit or it's organized, it's a mission-based business. Have you tried going to a foundation to ask for what is called a program-related investment? And that is typically a low-cost loan. It could be at zero interest. It's possible, I think a little unusual or more unusual. More typically, you're going to pay something that's very much the below market rate for that loan. It'll be in the range of 1% to 2%. And you can obviously pay that out over a certain time period. This is not like a grant, a typical grant where you're supposed to use it within a year. You're supposed to use it within 3 years. You can have a longer time period to pay that back. I mean, if you haven't explored that, try it.
I hope everybody walked away from this program with at least that one bit of information.
That's right. Try that.
Well, that does.
Go ahead, Jim, if you want, we can stay on the foundations thing. And again, anybody who works in foundations who's online, feel free to raise your hand. You can join the conversation. And also for those, I know Jay Reddy, maybe some other ones, people who do opportunity zones. If you've got other parallels to share, feel free to raise your hand or put something in the chat. We'll see if we can kind of break out that conversation. But let's stick with foundations. Go ahead, Jim.
Speaking of the sort of the evolution of this market, this activity. When I was chairman of the investment committee of a small private equity fund in Haiti, a social impact fund, and one of my good friends from prior experience still is a CIO of a major foundation, name brand foundation. I won't name it. And I had lunch with him, and I said, "Gosh, you're managing this, I think about $12-14 billion endowment. Why don't you carve off a piece of it to invest in social impact? Because that is also furthering your mission." And he was a very conservative guy. And he would say, no, my objective, my mandate is to provide the best risk-adjusted return, which is then put over to the program side that Andrea was referring to. And there are program people have the mentality of giving the money away. The idea of getting it back, it disturbs them. And so we try to argue how you can recycle the capital. And so there is a small program element of the sort that Andrea mentioned. There was, however, a change in senior management of this foundation about 5 years ago. And they made the decision that 10% of their endowment would in fact be invested in social impact in alignment with their mission. Because again, they felt that it was a positive direction to go in and would be very helpful to their mission. So I went back to my friend, the CIO, and said, "Oh, look, now you're mandated to invest 10% of your endowment in social impact." And he said, "Yeah, but somebody else is managing that. I'm not managing that." It was just something he couldn't get his arms around. So it's evolutionary, and that's why you've seen now that major foundations now are allocating a percentage of their endowment towards social impact in objectives that are close to their mission. And you're seeing now the major investment managers allocating or creating specific social impact funds, investment funds.
In all these scenarios and these kind of initiatives, there always a government component, a government agency of some sort, a city, a state, a country, an NGO, or have these been put together kind of purely in the private sector between maybe foundations, financial underwriters, third-party managers, anything like that?
In my experience, yes, but maybe not to the extent that you were thinking of. In Haiti, for example, we had no government. Well, when I say no local government, And this goes to the funders were DFIs in the fund that we were investing.
Okay.
In the Kenya, the Girls First Finance, there's no government entity and Kenyan government entity involved.
Okay. Okay. All right, Andrea, do you want to talk about some more specific examples and kind of things you've actually worked on, or whatever, however you want to kind of take the next part of this?
We're jumping into question 2?
Yeah, I think so. We'll talk about some of the opportunities and challenges of putting these things together. I think we've sort of started to hit on some of these about, getting like you said, getting everybody, both of you said, getting everybody together to work. I'd be curious to know, like how do they, I don't know, how do you get everybody on board? How do you get the government? What are the financing things? And then implementing it, and then, whatever. So however you want to take this, some opportunities and challenges using this kind of a capital structure.
Sure. I'm going to share, stories can be very powerful. I'm going to share a story of a project that my organization's currently working on. This project is actually under construction this year, and we're scheduled to finish in the fall. Many years in development. We are building a community-owned grocery store in a residential neighborhood in Detroit, where the residents got tired of waiting for a major chain grocery store to come into their neighborhood. This is a citywide problem in really most of Detroit, where residents end up having to drive out, not just their neighborhood, they end up in many cases driving out of the entire city to go into the suburbs to purchase groceries, because there's the city just doesn't have enough full service grocery stores, right? And certainly enough grocery stores that are offering fresh, healthy food at affordable prices, et cetera, et cetera. So the residents in this particular neighborhood just got tired of waiting for the chain grocery stores to come into their neighborhood. So they started their own food co-op that actually grew out of a community-based urban farm. And they realized that they had grown this program to the point where they really needed a physical space, a retail store, to take it to the next level. So my organization, which is a nonprofit real estate developer, we partnered with them. And so again, their work had been going on for a number of years, right?
Did they come to you? Did someone reach out to you?
Well, we were, the story I heard about that part of the project predated me. I think other players in the city said, you guys should talk to each other. So we were introduced to them, and a partnership formed. And so we agreed to be the developer for this community-based retail grocery store, which is going to house a food co-op. It's going to have an incubator kitchen for where food entrepreneurs can try out their products. They can rent the space, say if you're a caterer or baker, and you want to create your products and then you go and sell them in the stores. We're going to have outdoor vendor space that can be open in the warmer months of the year. There'll be indoor space to rent. So if you, again, let me go back to the example of a caterer. You have a client, you can actually serve your meal in the facility. There'll be like a community space you can rent on the second floor of it. So really all kinds of different, pop-up food events, community lectures related to food and nutrition. All of this stuff is going to be able to happen in this same space. It's a 30,000 square foot, 2-story facility. It's new construction. It's a $21 million project. So now imagine you're a community-based group that's been doing this on the ground, food access work in your neighborhood, and somebody tells you it's going to cost you $21 million to build your facility. What do you do, right? So this was the problem that we had to help them solve. We put together a very complex financial mix, new markets tax credit. Okay, so if you're familiar with certain kinds of investing, if you're familiar with housing finance, that's going to be very familiar to you. I like using this example of the food co-op, though, because people may not realize you can use it for things that aren't housing. So in this case, it's regarded as an economic development project. It's a community development project that has, that will create jobs and other economic benefits for the neighborhood. So that actually is the largest piece of capital in this project. It's over $5 million of new markets tax credit financing. It's a form of equity financing. Then we added in bank loans. Then I'm going to use that word I used before, program related investment. We went to foundations that we had relationships with, and we said, look, here's this number we got to hit. What can you put in? And so we had a local funder put in a $2 million loan at 1% interest. I mean, it's you can't get that deal right by going to a bank or a CDFI. So we got that. We added some government funding. So CDBG funding, again, very familiar to people work in housing and also in certain kinds of community services. That's a government funding that typically passes through a county or a city entity. We got 2 million of that to put in. We got 1.5 million in state economic development funding to put in. Then philanthropy, right? There was still a gap. The gap, in this case, it was quite significant. It was over $10 million. Our annual operating budget, we're a small developer team, 12 staff currently. Our annual budget ranges from 3 to 4 million in a typical year, depending on what we've got in the budget. So we were looking at having to raise $10 million in a fairly short period of time, just a couple of years, to fill this budget gap. And amazingly, what I love about this story is you can find a lot of stories where you just focus on what's dysfunctional about philanthropy and the power dynamics, and the funders don't want to give you a big enough grant. Everybody came to the table. I mean, we went and we asked. Some funders stretched their guidelines. They said, well, we don't do capital projects, or, we've never funded anything like this. They came to the table. $1 million grants, $500,000 grants. I mean, we just, $200,000 grants. We just kept piling it up until we hit the capital stack number that we needed to hit to close on permanent financing for this. Something to be aware of if you're doing a new markets tax credit funded project. And really, I encourage all kinds of organizations to look. We've built for sale affordable housing with new markets tax credit financing. We got $6 million of that kind of financing to build affordable single family homes, 23 of them, and we sold in the neighborhood surrounding this food co-op. We bought a bunch of property surrounding the food co-op because we knew as soon as the general community knew that this store was going to come, other developers were going to come in and capitalize off of this great amenity. And we wanted to preserve as much affordable housing as we could. And we worked on that ahead of time with the city to get first right to plots of land. And so this project is actually going to be the centerpiece of a larger housing development project that's been going on for years. And there's a mix of rental housing as well as affordable for sale housing that we're doing in the adjacent community. So it's a really, really cool project. And, and it's so exciting that it's actually real live. It's under construction right now. And optimistically, we're hoping that the actual store, there's going to be prepared food and so forth also available in the facility. We're hoping that can actually open before the end of this year.
Fascinating. And so what was the portion? So the only financing component that has a return on investment is the bank loans portion. Is everything else ultimately a grant or donation?
No, you've got new markets tax credit, which is equity financing. You've got bank loans, and then you've got program related investment loans, which are from, we had several of them. Yeah.
And are there separate loan agreements? Like, just maybe it's the lawyer in me, like, how does this stuff get papered? And maybe I'll ask the other question of what happens if the measurements don't get met and they're expecting to get 3% return, or people who bought the bonds, the government hold, like, how does that all get weighed in? Or maybe we haven't been doing this. I mean, I know there's some have matured already, but
Yeah, it's I guess that is a relevant question, like what if, and of course, and I actually love that you asked that question, because of you, as you might imagine, when we were going to some of our funders, and not just the investment funders, but some of our philanthropy funders, they asked the same question. They said, so it's hard running food businesses, whether it's a food co-op or or it's a prepared food business that's operating out of this facility. What if it doesn't work? We said, well, in a worst case scenario, where there is going to be this new construction building that has all this food equipment in and so forth, we would have to look to bring in some kind of other tenant or tenants to utilize the facility. And I guess in a very worst case scenario, and this is true for any kind of real estate development, you just have to sell the thing flat out. But we are the co-owners of this property, so we're in it for the long term with our nonprofit partner that's operating the food co-op, and some of the other food programs that are going to be located at this facility. So, we're going to succeed together, or we're going to fail together. So,
like, what happens to the building? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess some of these have guarantees. I mean, like the bank loans and the other one credits, like, are they, what's their security? Do they get to take the property? Like, just curious to know how that.
Well, I'll share another finance tip for anyone that's doing it could be a project like this or something else where you need to put together a lot of different kinds of financing to make it happen. Your philanthropy partners, again, can really help you out with something that's not a grant. In some cases, they can offer to back a loan for you. You can go and say, we've got a loan, and the lender's nervous because you haven't done this, what you're doing before, your partner hasn't done it, or we're concerned about how the financials look, and you can get them to agree to back the funding. So be creative, look at the different kinds of partners you have to see if they can help you get over the financial hurdles that you may be experiencing. I will also note with some humor, our CEO, who by the way is a Black woman and a native Detroiter, and that this makes her really unusual in real estate development in so many ways. She is an attorney, and she has an MBA degree, and she has a background in corporate finance. And let me tell you, every single day of her job, she's using all that training and all that experience.
I can just hear all these things going, oh my God, you got to work that out, and who's going to do this? And I can imagine very complicated.
Yeah. So we're fortunate to have a leader who just, she didn't have to be trained to understand a lot of this, although, I should also note, you don't have to have that kind of background to do projects like this. Or you're going to find a lot of organizations where the leaders don't have backgrounds like this, but certainly it helps. And so, and I'm part of the finance team, and we have a really experienced CFO who has a background both in commercial real estate as well as nonprofit affordable housing finance. And so, and our real estate director has a background, mostly actually, he came to us mostly with a corporate real estate development and finance background. But we've got a mix of expertise on our team, including some people who just their whole career has been in nonprofit services and or nonprofit affordable housing development. So it's a mix of experience.
No, it sounds very sophisticated as a means of kind of achieving some of these social impacts. Jim, do you want to kind of add anything with respect to what the non-US kind of markets look like in some of these really interesting kind of ways, or what some of the challenges and opportunities, or how things are developing maybe in some other countries?
I'll try to keep it a little brief, but let me tell one anecdote. I'm an advisor to a company called Africa Integris. And this was started by a woman who was a Yale graduate who worked in the real estate department at Yale. And Yale was one of the first universities to consciously build out the area around the university for commercial retail housing. She was asked to do the same in several universities in Africa, but the one I'll talk about is the University of Ghana. And because she, like me are passionate about the education, importance of education, and particularly girls and women. The availability of tertiary education in Africa is constrained by the lack of dormitory space. There's just not enough affordable space for people from the villages to come into the cities where the university is. So she did a project for the University of Ghana, about a $40 million project for dormitories. And we put together a local bank, letters of credit, local financing. We put together guarantees, local bank guarantees. But the vice chancellor of the university was the one who was really in charge of it, from the university side. We also got the DFC involved, but we went out looking for equity investors for about 35 million, I think it was. We tried to find local African investors and get a diverse group of equity investors from Africa. And it just wasn't coming up to the total. And then we had one big real estate company in the US, a well-known name, come in. And they saw the opportunity not just for this, but for the rest of Africa. In other words, building their business out. So they're pretty excited about it. But two things happened. We also, by the way, got insurance on the investment. So the project started, and then the vice chancellor left, and a new vice chancellor came in. He claimed that he knew nothing about the project. He didn't have any of the materials, even though it was right next door of his CFO's office. It got into a rather nasty, I don't want to go into too much depth. It's in the public domain, but very personal accusations. And the project stopped. The U.S. investor got gun shy. They had a change in management, decided that Africa was not where they should be. And so it ended up going through arbitration and settlement, insured settlement. Oddly enough, the equity investor, the U.S. equity investor, actually made more money than they would have if they had stayed with the project. But the project stopped, and now we're trying to restart the project. And I guess the point of that is to just emphasize the complexity of it all in these markets where you're dealing with structures that are not as mature. Although, I always hasten to add, let's be careful what we say about other countries, because in the U.S. we have some real problems too. And also dealing with personalities, the individuals, and they can make a real difference. So that's we think the project's going to get started again. We hope. We are working on a project at Kenyatta University. But so I just mentioned those since we're talking about real estate, which is not my forte by any means. Not something I enjoy talking about, Andrea.
Well, good. We've got a good balance here. Well, maybe as we're getting closer to the end of the hour, we can focus. You can tell me whether it's anecdotes or stories or kind of what you've seen. We've just spent some time on how these projects get put together, who finances, and what those details are. And now let's look at the sort of the impact side. Like, is this stuff really working? Should it be? Is it catching on more in the sense? I'm like, who might be driving it? Because we're here as social impactors ourselves, a lot of nonprofits, everybody's working on a lot of issues, a lot of overlap, and you can argue about whether some things have improved over the years in these various housing, homelessness, addiction, women, you name the topic. So, what are the good things to say? Should we be telling more stories about this? And I know for those of us who work in nonprofits and maybe who have grants, are we seeing a little loosening up of like, stop with the numbers and trying to, work towards, you're going to get the metrics that you're asking for. And are we seeing maybe a more hopeful turn to the actual, which is harder to tackle, the larger impact of improving lives, the preventative work, that, we're not going to have as much many own in-house people because we're able to tackle some things going on in the community. Anyway, so let's talk at that kind of broader level. Andrea or Jim, okay, Jim, you want to stick with
I'm very hopeful, again, for the long term. And we have to keep moving forward. It's not going to be a constant straight line. There'll be bumps. I work a lot, we talked about mentoring. I mentor and coach a lot of young people because they're idealistic. And what I'm trying to do is to get them far enough along so that they can actually successfully execute some of their idealistic missions before they become jaded or spoiled or corrupted. And there are good things happening. A few years ago, I was asked to be a resident expert at the African Leadership University in the campus in Kigali. And I was coaching some young entrepreneurs there, and I followed them. And this is 4 years ago, maybe. They were talking about the circular economy. And Kigali, I don't know if you all are familiar with it, but Rwanda, despite all the other issues we know about Rwanda, which exist, is trying to be a center of innovation in Africa. So this one gentleman that young man that I was coaching, was into recycling. And he started with the recycling computers and with working with Samsung. And then he has developed technology apps so that if you have something to recycle, you can put it out there and people will come and pick it up and all sorts of things. I mentioned that just as a small example of here in this African country, you have some very interesting innovation. In terms of health, another company that I advise is Mata Nova, which is actually based in Providence, Rhode Island. And it provides obstetric and gynecological devices and resources to low-resource countries around the world. These kinds of things are needed. They're very, very successful, and it's growing. But we have to keep at it. We have to be patient, persistent, and we have to retain that idealism.
Andrea, what are your sort of thoughts of the kind of larger, I mean, you've got the housing thing, you clearly believe in it passionately, you're breaking ground, you're doing it. Go ahead. What are some thoughts on the sort of larger scope?
Rich, I'm at an interesting point in my career in that I have a lot of expertise in philanthropic funding, and that's really the majority of the work I do, in addition to dealing with some impact investment funding. But a lot of what I feel like I'm doing is working with leaders of different kinds of organizations to get them away from their obsession with grants, philanthropy, so because I think it's a limitation of the financial mix in a lot of mission-based organizations that, you'll have the board is obsessed with philanthropic funding. I think that's the solution to like all the organization's financial health issues. The nonprofit leaders are obsessed with pushing staff to get grants. There is so much other kind of funding out there. So I really encourage all of my colleagues and friends who are here in this meeting with us, like if your organization is not yet exploring the kinds of financial tools that Jim and I are talking about, and if you feel like there's more work to be done, and if you had more financial resources or your organization could just be more stable, the current fantasy that I've seen a lot of organizations have is Mackenzie Scott is going to just drop out of the sky and, give us like one of her wonderful grants. What she's doing is wonderful, but that's not a financial plan for an organization to sort of wait for that kind of funding to just suddenly appear, or again, to do what's more typical, which is really just, avoid dealing with debt, not explore equity, not do the research on social impact bonds or funding other types of impact investing, because maybe folks are afraid of it, or they're not sure that they have the right partners to work with. I encourage everyone who's interested in these issues, just stretch your boundaries on it, because they're inevitably around both the U.S. and Jim has provided us some very interesting examples globally. There are going to be relevant examples of other types of impact investment funding that's been able to move projects. And ultimately, I think we're always working not just against the demands, the human demands that are out there, but we're working against time. And funding can really, the right kind of funding can help you reduce the time that's required to move your project. This is especially true in real estate development. I have seen projects just sit around for years because in some cases, I mean, it's not necessarily even a huge amount of funding, but like a small amount of, like $500,000 or $1 million like funding gap, like can just stall a project. And it's, seeing this happen in the housing sector is what motivates me to do the work that I do.
Yeah.
To get those projects moving.
I mean, I can see even in Jim, some of his, dormitory college, like every year dorms don't get built, like how many hundreds of students are not able to go get an education. I mean, you can see I mean, that's a great, there, I just gave everybody a pitch for how to sell your projects. All right. Go ahead.
Another concern I have, Rachel, and I use that word concern, I know far too often, but is obtaining a grant, building an organization or building an expense base from the grant, and then not making enough progress to get another grant, if you understand what I'm saying. In other words, think in terms of building an entity that it's going to be sustainable and plan for the long term, long haul in that.
This is great. I want to be able to, first of all, thank you, Andrea and Jim. Hopefully this was a lot of information. I have lots of resources. We were trying to throw them in the chat for people who wanted to dig deeply. I know I've already seen some very specific questions. Can I get in touch with the panelists? I've got follow-up questions, but I want to open it up if people have, I would love to hear from folks at foundations, other nonprofits who have questions. Ken, is there anybody you want to put them on mute, and anybody in the room at the Yale Club, and then anybody who's online? I'm going to put us off of, I'm going to put this to gallery so I can see everyone. And there aren't a whole lot of us here. I think I've got 22 different screens, plus however many people in the room. So I can actually see everyone. So if you have a question, just raise your hand. Ken, let me just ask you in the room, anything going on in there? Anybody have questions there?
Trevor, go ahead. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. I actually have two questions, but given time, I'll just ask the broader one first. So thank you both for your time and for informing us about all these things. And Jim, I appreciate what you mentioned about the backlash in certain parts of the country and in Congress to impact investing and ESG. Our foundation is actually almost 100% mission aligned at this point. So it's mostly ESG and some pockets of impact investing, but we realized that the next step was to actually apply our investment policy statement principles to our retirement plan, which a lot of folks have not actually thought about yet. Like your retirement investments do have impact as well. And oftentimes you don't, like you have investments in sectors you don't want to actually be invested in. So there's been increasing demand from millennials, Gen Z, and some more nonprofits we work with to have retirement planning options that allow them to be mission aligned and affordable. It took us, and by us I mean me, this was very painful and annoying process of almost 2 years to find an affordable retirement plan that met our standards. And now Congress, Republicans in Congress are pushing against the DOL rule for ESG, and there's a chance that they could override a Biden veto. So if that happens, what do you all think is the next step for the organizations who've taken who are trying to do, even more beyond the endowment, but also with their retirement plans, if a Republican Congress blocks, because there are startups that have come to meet this demand in the past few years. The more people want retirement plans that are mission aligned ESG, consider it.
Is yours a private pension or public?
It's a private family foundation.
And so why would you be bound by laws from Congress on a private pension?
I think the concern is not just us, but we also know that some of the vendors have emerged to offer retirement plans that allow for ESG investing and considerations are not just catering to foundations. They're catering to some social impact startups. They're catering to some of the nonprofits. It's a wider range of folks, not just private family foundations.
So you're concerned that your provider may be constrained.
Correct.
Oh, okay. And then your question, what do you do about it?
Yeah, they have to meet a fiduciary standard in order to offer a plan.
Yeah, only faith-based pension plans have actually have some exceptions to ERISA that allow them to invest beyond ESG into like private impact with a concessionary return, but even the public pension plans like that are governed by ERISA and that have the higher fiduciary standard are being threatened by the rulemaking at DOL. So I'm on board.
Actually, I'm glad you mentioned faith-based, and I'm certainly not here to promote any faith or another, but I think that as you're looking for, this is a slightly different topic, but as you're looking for funding for some of your missions, whether it be in healthcare or mental health, areas like that, the faith-based, and we are, in fact, when I mentioned for Girls First Finance, we're presenting to a faith-based group next month, and their approach is much more mission-oriented. Just sort of leave it at that. So I'm glad to hear that they are excluded, as I heard you say. As in terms of what you can do about it, my gosh, I don't know. Vote. I mean, I mentioned I'm down here in Florida, and I just can't believe what is going on here in Texas. But it gets into a very political argument. I think that ESG came out of the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. And ESG is a lot of what I consider to be the negatives. Thou shalt not pollute the environment, thou shalt not hire child labor. Whereas social impact investing, in my simple definition, is the thou shalts. What are you doing to improve society? And of course, not hurting it, but what are you doing to improve it? But I don't see this lasting. And this gets into a political argument. I just don't see how a fight against ESG is going to be successful over the long term, given what's happened, whether it be climate change or any other aspect of it, human rights, child. I'm sorry to hear. I didn't actually know that was in Congress.
I have a question related to that, but I'll hold off because I want to not take up too much time.
Great. Thank you for asking. Is there anybody else on Zoom who wanted to ask a question before we go back to the live room?
Yeah, here, Bob Barnett. And I'm coming to this new, so I may be asking some very basic questions, but I'm also just trying to see if I have a clarity of understanding of what you're communicating. So a couple of questions, and I'm just going to give you kind of a menu of subjects that you can touch on in whatever way. What is the typical maturity of these bonds? In other words, we're talking 10, 15 years. I mean, what is the range that is typical for that? It sounds like from what you're saying, these are ideally suited for capital projects simply because it's easier in a capital project to establish parameters of investment expectations and therefore able to monitor the results. And therefore also, this is also going to be handled not as a standalone, but as a portfolio of funding resources. And in that sense, based on a track record of a nonprofit, is it intended to, in a certain sense, as seed money to bring in other funding? Or is it meant, I mean, I think it's probably in multiple ways. It can be used as seed money to pull in other funding, but also something of a package. But it also could be, in a certain sense, be used in terms of a top-off as a way of pulling all the other funding opportunities together to kind of consolidate. So those are just some thoughts and questions.
I'll give you my answers quickly and then hand over to Andrea because she'll have much more detail. Most of the bonds I've seen have been 10 years. In terms of capital projects, no. In fact, most of the work that I've seen in terms of social impact bonds has been related to not the construction that Andrea is kind of talking about, but with upskilling might be an example. lot of job training, and where the return comes from the improved economic performance of the individuals. So that it's not strictly capital, if you will. Same with a lot of the medical and mental health issues. And then in terms of the last bit, yes, ideally I would see it as one piece of the capital structure. But Andrea?
Okay, so in mission-oriented real estate development, because obviously, as I just shared the example of the food co-op, that it can be more than housing. Typically it's 5 to 7 years, right? Is the investment term, and something to remember and consider when you're talking about real estate, you can refinance, and that's typically what happens, right? I mean, interest rates change. You understand a lot more about the cash flow, the real not just what you put into the spreadsheet, but the real cash flow of the property, after your first 5 years. So when you're a nonprofit developer, you're looking to refinance, to try to get a better deal. And so that answers the first part of the question. In terms, another part of the question was about, is the impact investment going in first, in addition to, say, your traditional bank loans, et cetera. And the answer is definitely yes. Your tax credit finance, the first parts of financing for nonprofit real estate development are typical, so you're going for those pieces first. Your tax credit financing, your bank loans. I'm going to keep saying that word again, program related investments. If you can do the work to get those, they will move typically faster and sooner than a grant will. This is an interesting thing about grants, because they have a shorter time window. To close on your tax credit financing, you have to be able, they want to see that you have all this funding in place, which may or may not actually be the case. With the food co-op, we still had a funding gap by the time we really need it for all kinds of practical and financial reasons to actually close on the financing. And so what we had to do was add in another construction loan and just assure our financial partners that we were going to be able to close the gap for that with philanthropic funding, which, we had the expertise, we had the relationships, we knew we could do it, and they had to trust that. If we hadn't been able to do it, we would have had to use we have other sources of income in our organization, from developer fees, property fees, et cetera. So we would have had to use other kinds of income to pay for it if we couldn't actually put together all the philanthropy funding that we needed. But your philanthropy piece is probably, maybe some of it you get commitments early, but that's going to come in later. It's a shorter window typically. You're lucky if you can get, we have $1.5 million grants and $1 million grants that are over 2 years. It's really not a long time. When you're thinking in the longer term of the actual social impact work that you're trying to do, the actual social impact outcomes of the work, it's not a long time. But it is what that window, that 2-year window for some of those big grants, or in many cases, the 1-year window of the grant, that's what we needed to actually just close on the financing to construct the property. But, to the points that Jim's been touching on, some of the points that I've been touching on, you can't actually do the work that delivers the social impacts in a year or 2 years. It's impossible. You can't do it, and you can't measure it in that short a window. So you're going to have that longer term investment funding so that you actually have that time to do the work and measure it. To see if the whole point of what you're doing is actually effective and sustainable.
This This was great. Thank you. Ed, Savi, I see you had your hand raised. Go ahead.
Hi, folks. Appreciating this conversation very much. Briefly, so I serve on the board of the Asian Community Fund of the Boston Foundation. And Andrea, to your point about sort of longevity and kind of long tail, if you will, or long lead times, are you or Jim seeing anything innovative from community foundations in intersections with the work that you do in terms of building social impact over a long term?
We have worked hard with CDFIs in Rhode Island, particularly, and the banks in the Northeast. I think you're up in the Boston area. You said
Yes.
that they allocate allocate a percentage of their portfolio to what we call social impact investing.
Great, thanks.
I have seen examples of things that work and sort of help, all the partners involved get through the challenges of the work. And then I've seen the limitations.
Mm-hmm.
So let me give an example of the limitations. I've seen, including in this project, I'm not going to name a specific funder, but
Sure.
Where the funder just their current priorities are, they say they want to empower the community, but like we don't fund capital projects. So the nonprofits are supposed to pay landlords, and how are they supposed to really like control the be empowered in their neighborhood? They can't they can't do real estate projects, right? Like they can't get the support rather from the funder to do the real estate projects. So, but they did, a local funder did come in with some funding, and they just sort of stretched the boundaries. We said, well, it's for the building. It's not capital per se, like it's for some equipment and things in the building. That's how we got around that challenge. But yeah, I would encourage, so number one, like if you can do capital projects strategically, like if you can fund it, do it. It's actually really can make this enormous difference in many neighborhoods. And examples of things that I've seen happen with community foundations that have worked have been those program related investments. The foundations that have it's funding, it's from individual, like high net worth families and so forth, and that that capital, right, that's often kind of in a black box, right? Meaning it's not, let's just say it's not as visible as the foundation's other funding. We've had some situations where we have been able to actually access that funding. And get like $500,000 or $1 million. And it's so flexible, and it's been so helpful to us. So yeah, there's definitely a huge role that foundations can play.
I work more with startups, Social Enterprise Greenhouse in Providence, and find that CDFI, the bank allocation of CDFI, that they don't have the expertise or the resources to do the due diligence. So they would provide the funds to us, and then we would then allocate it as we see fit, according to our own analysis and due diligence. So they're more comfortable doing that than trying to make individual loans themselves.
Sure. Thank you.
Can I get a quick response to Ed there?
Please.
Hi, Ed. You can't see me. I'm Jean. I'm here in New York. I just finished a project with the Essex County Community Foundation, so just a little to your north. And they're about to come out. I've talked to 10 different community foundations around the country who are doing super innovative work exactly in this area, how they're doing impact investing, either convening people to do it, bringing the high net wealth investors in, or investing their own money. And we're coming out with some work on that soon. But if you just want to call up to Stratton, I'll think of his name. I'll send it to you, up at Essex County. I'm sure they'd be happy to talk to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Sure.
This is awesome. See, beautiful things happen when we get a lot of smart, mission-driven people in the same room. We're very close to, we've been over here an hour and a half, and I know our panelists, thank you so much. Any last questions? Anybody who's online? For those who, I mean, I know we're welcome to stay, but I don't want to take up Jim and Andrea's time. We've been relying on them a lot. Jim, do you want to?
I would just emphasize that if you want to continue a conversation, I am more than happy to talk much more depth, well, at least much more broadly, maybe not so much depth, and put people in contact with other people, et cetera. That's what I enjoy doing. And if you don't have access to my email or phone,
Well,
you can get it through
you can share
Rachel.
it. Yep. Andrea, are you okay as well, having your contact at work shared?
Some people have already asked me in the chat. I've received messages. And so the answer is yes. And I've had some people contact me from LinkedIn, and that's a way you can reach me too. And yes, I'm glad to share information. So
okay, good. Hopefully we can continue, have all these conversations continue on. I sort of feel like we need to do a part 2 and invite the foundations and the CDFI and the community investment funds to answer and talk about kind of what's going in. Maybe we'll do another program of those, and let's go back to some of these. And if anybody has recommendations, either for foundations who are being very stubborn or ones that are being very innovative, and let's see if we can kind of bring some more conversations and move some of this needle a little bit, and including some of these nonprofit projects, whether you're doing real estate or something else where you're starting to explore some of this other creative financing. Let us know about it, because it seems like we've hit on something that everybody needs to learn more about. And Andrew, thank you for emphasizing some of these program, what do they call them? Program funds or program
related investments.
Program-related investments. Ask your foundation. Okay. Anyone else in the room there? Ken, I want to give you guys last time. I see people having to drop off for family and other reasons, so I'm sensitive to that.
Yeah, it's a real quick question. Yeah,
Yes.
first, thank you to the panel and everyone in the room. It's definitely worthwhile for me and my undergraduate colleagues to have made the trip from New Haven. To be
Delighted.
But yeah, just really quick question: are there any opportunities or areas of involvement that we can get involved in at the undergraduate side? I run a club as a first year in New Haven, and we're all about social impact opportunities and finding, established social impact ventures that we can partner with. So are there any areas between the panelists or even Yana as a whole organization?
Arthur Thomas.
What?
Arthur Thomas?
Arthur Thomas of the.
I haven't heard it. I think I've heard of his name, but I don't
He's
work with
good.
him.
We should
Arthur Thomas?
talk,
Okay.
yeah.
Also mentioned the U.S. Social Investment Forum has been on for a long time, and they're actually where to go on policy and advocacy. They spend a lot of time lobbying with the SEC and the DOL.
I have a lot of the reports.
Okay.
Who was that? Can you guys just speak up from the room? Who was that does a lot of lobbying? Whoever just spoke?
So the U.S. Social Investment Forum does a lot of this policy work. They also have a scholarship program for undergrads and grad students to attend their conference every year, which is like, I would say it leans sort of more towards like asset management, fund management, like mostly public, but also some private, as opposed to like entrepreneurship. But it's a really good place to meet and make lots of contacts in the industry. Very interested.
Okay.
And SOM as well.
SOM also has an impact investing fund that they just started, but I'm not sure if undergrads can participate, but it's definitely for the MBA students.
Okay.
And Arthur, I was shouting out Arthur Thomas, who's Div graduate. He's at the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven.
And he's a Div graduate.
Yeah,
Okay, cool.
I know him as well.
He's
Okay.
very good.
I think.
Yep, great. We have a lot of Yana members, board members who are actively involved and invest through the New Haven Greater New Haven Community Foundation. Places for students. Andrew, go ahead. Sorry, you had your hand raised.
If anyone's interested in affordable housing investments specifically, and or mission-based real estate development, message me, because I'll have some, I don't have the names of all these impact investment firms and so forth readily available to rattle off in my head, but I have links that I can share. It's not, if you just like randomly look for it, I think, because I'm somebody that has to do this, right? It's part of my job. It's not easy to, and this is the challenge, I think, of the sector, and just speaks to how much work there is to do, that you would think it could be easy, you know, say, I want to invest, you know, several $100,000 or $1 million or something in affordable housing and figure out what kind of return I could get. And, you know, and I want to do that in a particular region. It's not necessarily easy to find out, like, how would you actually do that? I think unless you're like working in this industry.
Yeah, I got to say, I because of some of these case studies that Andrea and Jim had told me, I went in, read some of that stuff, and then went to see who the players are, and like, oh, I'd never heard of that something capital company and MDRC or whatever. So I started to pull some of those out, and I'll add those as well. And I was like, gosh, if I had known about this, I would have done that rather than private sector. So, you know, and for you students there, I think it'd be good to highlight some of these other options that are available and maybe not so easy to find. So great question.
I would second that. Again, going back to my point about working with young people, getting them while we can, helping them be successful as young people so they'll make this world a better place. And I have a lot of contacts in social impact investing firms, admittedly more overseas in the US, but happy to put people in touch with each other.
Excellent. Sounds like another resource we can start to gather for the benefit of our members and the students and such. Thank you. Thank you to Andrea and to Jim. Thank you very much. This was incredibly enlightening. I hope very practical and helpful to everyone who's on the line and in the room. So thanks for joining us again. Please support us. We love to give these programs for free. We rely on the volunteers as our speakers and all the other work that helps this happen and bringing people together to create these kind of synergies. So keep it going, go forth, and we'll hopefully see you at the next program.